Just before midnight on August 19th, 2026, the most aggressive tariff weapon Washington had built against Canada in nearly a century was hours away from going live. And then it didn't. Donald Trump posted 4 words on Truth Social that stopped the entire operation cold. Canada and the USA, subject to the finalization of documents, have a deal. No press conference, no signing ceremony, just a late-night social media post pulling back a 50% tariff wall that had been engineered for exactly this moment. If you think that sounds like a last-minute miracle, it wasn't. It was the predictable ending to a standoff that Canada had been quietly winning for weeks, and almost nobody watching the headlines understood why. This channel breaks down the financial and political moves that mainstream coverage gets wrong, so if that's the kind of analysis you want, hit subscribe now, because this story has layers most people never saw coming. Let's rewind to where this actually started, because the origin of this fight tells you everything about how it was always going to end. On July the 20th, 2026, President Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. That number, 1930, is not a typo. Section 338 is a provision buried inside one of the most infamous pieces of economic legislation in American history, the same law that helped trigger a global collapse in trade during the Great Depression. It had never once been used by a sitting president to actually impose tariffs. Not during Korea, not during Vietnam, not during the Cold War, not during the 2008 financial crisis, and not during Trump's own first term. The last time it was even referenced in an official proceeding was 1949. For 77 years, this statute sat completely dormant, and then in the summer of 2026, someone in the White House legal team dusted it off and handed the president a weapon with almost no procedural friction attached to it. To understand why they reached for something this old, you have to go back a few months earlier. In February 2026, the United States Supreme Court delivered a ruling that gutted Trump's most flexible trade tool. The court found that tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the broad authority Trump had used to hit dozens of countries simultaneously, were not legally valid. That ruling stripped away the fastest, widest tariff mechanism the executive branch had. Trade lawyers celebrated. Markets briefly exhaled. But inside the administration, the search for a replacement began almost immediately. Section 301 requires a formal investigation by the United States Trade Representative before any tariff can be imposed. Section 232 requires an official national security determination. Both take months, sometimes longer. Section 338 required neither. The president could act by proclamation alone, and the clock would start the moment his signature hit the page. Speed and legal simplicity were the entire appeal. That is precisely why it was chosen, not because it was the strongest legal foundation, but because it was the fastest one available after the Supreme Court closed the previous door. So, on July the 20th, 3 proclamations went out, each one targeting a specific dispute. The first hit alcoholic beverages, in direct response to Canadian provinces pulling American liquor off government store shelves starting in early 2025, a coordinated response to Trump's initial tariffs that year. The second hit dairy products, tied to a long-running argument over how Canada's supply management system allocates tariff rate quotas, with Washington arguing that Canada gives the European Union more generous cheese access under its CETA agreement than it gives the United States under USMCA. The third hit motor vehicles, responding to a 25% Canadian surtax on non-compliant American vehicles, which was itself a retaliation to earlier American steel and aluminum tariffs. Each proclamation carried the same penalty, an additional 50% duty stacked on top of whatever tariffs already applied. And here is the detail that blindsided trade lawyers across Washington and Ottawa alike. These new duties applied regardless of whether a product qualified for preferential treatment under USMCA. For years, a valid certificate of origin under that agreement functioned as a shield. Section 338 broke that shield completely. A Canadian-made vehicle that qualified for duty-free treatment under the very trade agreement Trump himself negotiated in his first term could still get hit with the full 50%. Altogether, the United States Trade Representative estimated these 3 proclamations covered close to $20 billion in Canadian imports annually, spanning 554 separate tariff lines. The list reads almost absurdly wide once you look past the headline categories: wine, cement, furniture, clothing, wigs, fishing rods, seeds, and yes, hockey sticks and hockey equipment, sitting right there in the same annex as dairy and motor vehicles. The White House framed the entire action as leveling the playing field for American workers, farmers, and exporters who had allegedly been discriminated against for years. Canadian officials and a fair number of American trade lawyers framed it very differently. They pointed out that Section 338 predates the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It predates the World Trade Organization. It predates virtually every modern trade institution built after the Second World War. Legal scholars, including analysts cited by the National Law Review, argued the statute had effectively been superseded by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974, meaning the entire legal foundation for these tariffs was resting on ground that had arguably already shifted decades ago. That is a genuine vulnerability sitting underneath the headline numbers, and it matters more than it sounds like at first, because legal uncertainty changes how a negotiation actually plays out behind closed doors. Now here's where the story gets interesting, because Washington built something into these proclamations that almost nobody noticed at first glance. Energy products were excluded, potash was excluded, critical minerals were excluded, fish was excluded. On paper, those exclusions look like generosity, a courtesy carved out for a close ally and neighbor. In reality, they are the opposite. They are Washington publicly admitting exactly where its own vulnerability sits, before Canada even had to say a word. Canada supplies the overwhelming majority of the crude oil that flows into American refineries, particularly across the Midwest, where facilities have been engineered and calibrated over decades specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. You cannot swap that supply chain overnight. Retrofitting those refineries to run on a different crude grade would cost billions of dollars and take years, not months. Touching that flow with a 50% tariff would not punish Canada. It would immediately spike fuel costs across the American industrial Midwest, and that is not a risk any White House wants, sitting on the table heading into a midterm election cycle. Potash tells an almost identical story. The United States depends on imports for the vast majority of its potash consumption, the mineral that supplies potassium, one of the 3 essential nutrients every major American crop needs to grow at scale alongside nitrogen and phosphorus. Canada, and specifically Saskatchewan, sits on the largest recoverable potash reserves on the planet, more than Russia, more than Belarus, more than every other producer combined. Trump had actually floated tariffs on Canadian potash once before, back in late 2025, and the idea disappeared almost as quickly as it surfaced because agricultural lobbies across the American Midwest pushed back hard enough to kill it before it ever became policy. Farm groups understood instantly what a potash disruption would mean for planting costs, and by extension, for grocery prices in every state in the country. So when Section 338 came together in July 2026, potash walked away untouched again, right alongside energy. Add critical minerals to that list, materials like uranium, tellurium, and niobium, which Canada supplies in significant volume, and which feed directly into electric vehicles, semiconductors, and defense manufacturing, and a clear pattern starts to form. Washington tariffed everything Canada could absorb the pain from, and exempted everything Canada actually held leverage over. That is not the posture of a negotiator holding all the cards. That is the posture of a negotiator who already knows exactly where the ceiling is. This is the part of the story that almost no mainstream coverage connected properly, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Every one of those excluded categories represents leverage. Canada never had to threaten out loud. Doug Ford, the Ontario Premier, did threaten potash publicly, standing in front of reporters in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, in July, saying Canada could dismantle the American economy if it wanted to, and specifically naming potash as the card worth playing. His comments rattled markets for a news cycle. But here's the twist. Ford was not speaking for the federal government, and Prime Minister Mark Carney never endorsed the threat publicly. Carney did something almost the opposite of what Ford was doing. He said nothing specific at all. Asked directly what retaliation Canada was considering, Carney told reporters it would be counterproductive to name any measure while negotiations were still live. He simply said everything is on the table and refused to elaborate further again and again for weeks. That silence was not indecision. It was strategy, and understanding why requires understanding who Mark Carney actually is. This is a man who holds an economics degree from Harvard, a master's and doctorate in economics from Oxford, and who spent over a decade at Goldman Sachs before entering public service. He ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 global financial crisis. He then became governor of the Bank of England, the first person from outside the United Kingdom to ever hold that position in its 300-year history, and he steered that institution through Brexit and the opening shock of the pandemic. This is someone who has spent his entire career managing systemic financial risk at a scale most politicians never touch. When a person with that background refuses to name his negotiating position and simply says everything is on the table, that is not weakness. That is someone who understands, at a level most trade officials never reach, exactly what happens when you reveal your position before the other side has revealed theirs. And there was a very specific legal reason for that discipline, buried inside the language of Section 338 itself. If Canada had retaliated formally, and the United States determined that retaliation increased the underlying discrimination the tariffs were supposedly correcting. Section 338 allowed for further escalation on top of what was already threatened. In other words, if Canada had fired back publicly before the August 19th deadline, Trump would have had a built-in legal justification to go even higher. Carney, who once chaired the Financial Stability Board and has spent his career thinking several moves ahead of market reactions, understood that trap immediately. So, while Doug Ford called publicly for a dollar-for-dollar retaliatory response, and a poll conducted by Angus Reid in July found that 62% of Canadians supported some form of retaliatory tariff, Carney simply absorbed the political pressure and kept his cards face down on the table. That decision satisfied nobody completely in the short term, but it kept every door open for the weeks that followed. While all of that silence played out publicly, something else was happening that mainstream trade coverage almost entirely missed. Canada was not simply waiting around for Washington's next move. Throughout 2026, Ottawa had been actively building an entirely separate trade architecture designed to reduce its dependence on the American market altogether. In late July, within days of the Section 338 proclamations being signed, Canada finalized a free trade agreement with Ecuador and, on the very same day, concluded a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with the United Arab Emirates, a deal negotiated and closed in just 47 days, a timeline the UAE's own trade minister publicly called historically fast. That UAE relationship came attached to a previously pledged $70 billion investment commitment into the Canadian economy. Around the same period, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority advanced a construction partnership for the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 expansion, a project projected to unlock more than $100 billion in additional annual trade capacity once complete, specifically designed to move more Canadian goods to buyers outside North America. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened because of the tariff fight. Carney's government had already committed to doubling Canada's non-American exports from roughly $300 billion to $600 billion within a decade, and every deal signed during this standoff functioned as quiet proof that the pivot was real, not just rhetoric aimed at strengthening Ottawa's negotiating position. Now, let's talk about what this trade fight actually cost in dollar terms, because the numbers on both sides of the border are far larger than most people realize. American vehicle exports to Canada fell by roughly 22% over the year, ending in early 2026, a drop of more than $5.5 billion, cited repeatedly by the White House as justification for the tariffs. But Canada did not simply stop buying vehicles altogether. It redirected that spending toward Mexico, Japan, South Korea, and Germany instead, meaning American automakers lost market share permanently to competitors, who quietly stepped into the gap. On the Canadian side, manufacturing output fell across nearly every major export category through the worst of the standoff, with steel exports down roughly a quarter, aluminum production dropping close to 20%, and tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs lost in a single year. Both economies were absorbing real, measurable pain simultaneously in different sectors, at different speeds. And that mutual damage is exactly what made the historical parallel so uncomfortable for anyone who studied it closely. In 1930, the original Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised duties on more than 20,000 imported goods to record levels, aiming to protect American farmers and manufacturers from foreign competition. Instead, it helped collapse global trade by roughly 65% between 1929 and 1934. Over 1,000 economists signed a public petition begging President Hoover not to sign it. Henry Ford personally spent an evening at the White House urging a veto. Hoover signed it anyway, and the world spent years dealing with the fallout. Section 338 sits inside that exact same piece of legislation, and using it again, nearly a century later against the same neighboring economy, was never going to be a clean or risk-free maneuver, no matter how fast and procedurally simple it was to execute. There's a second historical echo worth mentioning here too, because it explains exactly why the potash and energy exclusions mattered so much. In 1973, OPEC used coordinated oil supply restrictions as a direct weapon against American foreign policy, and the result was a roughly 400% spike in oil prices within a matter of months, along with gasoline lines, runaway inflation, and a deep economic downturn across the United States. America had some domestic oil production to fall back on at the time, which cushioned the blow somewhat. In 2026, the United States has almost no meaningful domestic potash production to fall back on if Canadian supply were ever seriously disrupted, with New Mexico and Utah producing only a small fraction of national demand. That structural parallel between energy dependency in 1973 and potash dependency in 2026 is uncomfortably close, and it is exactly why Washington built the exemption into its own proclamations before anyone in Ottawa had to formally ask for it. There's another layer to Ford's public threat that rarely gets mentioned, and it matters, because it shows just how fractured Canada's own internal position actually was underneath Carney's calm exterior. When Ford stood in Charlottetown and named potash as Canada's most powerful card, he was not speaking with the backing of the province that actually controls it, Saskatchewan Premier. Scott Moe rejected the idea publicly, saying his province would not turn its resources into a geopolitical bargaining chip. Alberta. Premier Danielle Smith flatly refused to put energy exports on the table at all. Quebec Premier Christine Fréchette said she simply was not ready to go that far either. Ford found himself standing in a minority position among his own fellow premiers, and that fracture actually strengthened Carney's hand rather than weakening it, because it let the federal government look measured and reasonable by direct comparison to a provincial leader publicly calling for economic warfare. Every time Ford escalated his rhetoric, Carney's silence looked more disciplined, not less, and that contrast became a genuine asset heading into the final weeks of negotiation. It's also worth understanding just how tangled this dispute was with the much larger question of what happens to USMCA itself, because Section 338 never existed in isolation. July 1st, 2026 marked the mandatory review deadline for the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the first joint review since the deal came into force. The United States chose not to extend it in its current form, which meant all three countries entered an open-ended renegotiation window with no fixed endpoint, one that some analysts warned could stretch toward the agreement's scheduled expiration nearly a decade out. Mexico's own parallel talks with American officials had already advanced further and faster, leaving Canada largely sidelined at points during the broader trilateral conversation, only resuming meaningful engagement after direct diplomatic pressure from Ottawa. That backdrop meant Carney was never just negotiating his way out of a $50 billion tariff threat. He was simultaneously trying to protect Canada's seat at a much larger table, one that determines the rules for roughly $1.3 trillion in annual cross-border commerce and shields close to 90% of Canadian exports from the full weight of American tariff schedules. Losing leverage in the Section 338 fight risked bleeding directly into a weaker Canadian position at the USMCA table, which is exactly why Carney refused to treat this as a narrow, isolated dispute that could be settled sector by sector. The investor angle underneath all of this deserves its own moment, because Wall Street and Bay Street were both quietly pricing in outcomes long before Trump's Truth Social post landed. Agricultural fertilizer producers, chief among them Nutrien, headquartered in Saskatoon, and Mosaic, the largest American fertilizer company, both saw their share prices move on nothing more than headlines out of Charlottetown and Ottawa, simply because any hint of a formal potash restriction would have triggered an immediate repricing across the entire agricultural supply chain. Corn, wheat, and soybean futures on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange showed early stress signals through the summer as traders weighed the possibility of a genuine fertilizer supply shock, even though potash itself was never actually part of the fight. That is the strange power of an exemption. Markets do not need a resource to actually get weaponized to start pricing in the risk that it might be. Simply knowing that Canada could, if it ever chose to, was enough to keep certain sectors on edge for weeks at a time. Quick pause here, because if this kind of breakdown is helping the picture click into place for you, drop a like and subscribe, since we're about to get into exactly how this standoff reached its final hours, and the numbers behind that ending are just as revealing as everything that came before it. Through the first half of August, the two sides moved into what officials on both sides described as an intense and delicate phase. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, and Canada's Chief Negotiator, Janice Charette, spent repeated stretches in Washington meeting directly with United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer. Prime Minister Carney told reporters in early August that talks had turned nasty at points, describing Trump's public comments about Canadian leadership as derisive, while still insisting Canada remained fully engaged because, as he put it, this is a question of Canadian jobs. He also drew a clear line publicly, saying he was not interested in a narrow, sector-by-sector deal, insisting instead on a comprehensive agreement that addressed autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products, together rather than piecemeal. Trump, for his part, kept up the same public posture he had held since the beginning, telling reporters at a General Motors plant in Michigan in late July that Canada needs America, not the other way around, and that he did not particularly care whether a deal got done at all. By the second week of August, the core sticking point had narrowed down to one specific number: automotive tariffs. Canadian negotiators were pushing to bring vehicle tariffs down from the existing 25% to 15%. American negotiators offered exactly that headline rate, 15%, but tied it to a condition Canada found difficult to accept, requiring the reduction to be calculated based specifically on American content inside each vehicle, rather than allowing all North American-sourced parts to qualify equally. Union leaders on the Canadian side, including the national president of Unifor, the union representing Canadian auto workers, noted that even a reduced headline rate of 15% was still meaningfully higher than pre-conflict levels, even if the effective rate could drop further, toward roughly 7.5% for vehicles with enough qualifying North American content. Neither side would confirm publicly that this gap had closed, and both governments kept the details of ongoing sessions almost entirely out of public view, with LeBlanc telling reporters after one meeting only that the work is continuing and that Canadian negotiators would keep doing their job. Then came the final 48 hours. Carney and Trump spoke by phone twice in as many days, once on Monday and again on Tuesday afternoon, just hours before the 50% tariffs were scheduled to take effect at 1 minute past midnight Eastern Time on Wednesday, August 19th. A source close to the negotiations described the discussions to Radio Canada as tough, adding plainly that the two sides were not there yet. Carney, speaking to reporters in French on the Monday before the deadline, said only that negotiations were very intense and delicate, and that this was not the time to discuss them in public. Behind that calm public language, Canadian officials were reportedly still pushing hard to bring tariff rates down further, arguing internally that further concessions without something meaningful in return would create a serious backlash at home and risk making the government look weak heading into future rounds of pressure from Washington. And then, less than 2 hours before the deadline, Trump posted on Truth Social that he was pausing the tariffs for a 3-day period, stating plainly that Canada and the United States, subject to the finalization of documents, had reached a deal. He added, almost as an aside, that the Keystone XL pipeline, killed years earlier under the previous administration, might be, in his words, awoken from the grave, without providing further detail on what that actually meant for the broader agreement. The Office of the United States Trade Representative followed with its own statement describing the emerging deal as including comprehensive market access for American goods, economic security commitments, and digital trade alignment provisions, while continuing to protect the American market and American workers alongside what it called Canadian partners. Carney's office responded with noticeably more caution than Trump's celebratory tone, confirming only that the Section 338 tariffs would be delayed until the end of the day on Friday, August 21st, while the details of any final agreement were still being worked out on paper. Think about what that sequence actually tells you, because it is the entire story compressed into one night. Washington built a 50% tariff wall covering roughly $20 billion in Canadian goods, deliberately excluded every category where Canada actually held structural leverage, watched Canada refuse to name a single retaliatory measure for weeks while quietly signing trade deals with Ecuador and the UAE and pouring billions into Pacific port infrastructure, and then, in the final hours before the deadline it had set itself, pulled the tariffs back based on a deal that still, as of the announcement, had not even been finalized on paper. That is not the ending of a negotiation, where one side simply overpowered the other. That is the ending of a negotiation where one side spent weeks holding leverage back and letting the other side's own exclusions do the talking for them. Now, let's talk about what this actually means for markets and everyday consumers, because the financial dimension of this standoff runs much deeper than the political headlines suggest. Canadian Federation of Independent Business President Dan Kelly noted that a 50% tariff essentially makes a product uneconomic to sell into a particular market entirely, and many of that organization's members, representing over 100,000 Canadian businesses, had already reported American buyers pulling back on orders simply in anticipation of the tariffs, well before they ever took effect. That is the hidden cost of a threat like this, damage that shows up in canceled purchase orders and delayed investment decisions long before a single extra dollar in duty is ever actually collected at the border. On the currency side, the Canadian dollar had touched its weakest level since April 2025 in the weeks leading into this deadline, before steadying somewhat on higher oil prices, and speculators had reportedly built up significant short positions against the loonie, betting that continued trade uncertainty would keep pressuring it lower. The Bank of Canada had already trimmed its growth forecast for 2026, citing trade policy uncertainty as a direct contributing factor to slower expected expansion. On the American side, the political calculus mattered just as much as the economic one. Nearly 72% of Canada's total goods exports still flow to the United States, meaning the relationship genuinely is massive, and Canada genuinely does depend on it in raw volume terms. But the administration was also weighing the risk of imposing a hefty new consumer-facing tariff heading directly into November's midterm election cycle, at a moment when American voters were already frustrated with the cost of living. 36 American states count Canada as their single largest export market, and industries from home construction, which depends heavily on Canadian lumber and cement, to food manufacturing, which sources dairy inputs like whey and cream from Canadian producers, were all sitting directly inside the tariff's blast radius. Every one of those industries has senators and representatives who answer to voters feeling the squeeze, and that kind of pressure accumulates quietly in the background, long before it ever shows up in a headline. There's also a legal thread running underneath all of this that never fully went away, and it may end up mattering more in the months ahead than anything negotiated in these final hours. Multiple trade law firms had already signaled that legal challenges to Section 338 were expected almost immediately once the tariffs took effect, built on the same core argument that struck down Trump's earlier, i.e. the AEPA-based tariffs. That broad, unilateral presidential tariff authority requires clearer congressional backing to survive judicial review. Canada had also indicated it would pursue parallel challenges through World Trade Organization dispute settlement mechanisms, and separately through USMCA's own Chapter 31 dispute process, a channel Canada has used successfully against American positions before. There's even a bill sitting in Congress called the Repealing Outdated and Unilateral Tariff Authorities Act, aimed at stripping Section 338 out of the law entirely, though it has not yet advanced past committee. None of that legal uncertainty disappeared just because a pause was announced on a Tuesday night. If anything, it remains one more clock quietly ticking in the background of whatever final agreement eventually gets signed. So where does this actually leave the relationship between these two countries? And what should you actually take away from all of this? First, leverage that never has to be spoken out loud is often more powerful than leverage that gets threatened publicly. Canada never formally weaponized potash, energy, or critical minerals, and it never needed to, because Washington had already told the entire world how much those categories mattered simply by choosing to exclude them from the fight in the first place. Second, diversification is not just a talking point anymore. The trade deal signed with Ecuador and the UAE, the port investment in Vancouver, the ongoing push toward markets in the Indo-Pacific and the Gulf, all of that gives Ottawa options it did not have in previous rounds of tension with Washington. And options change how a negotiation actually unfolds behind closed doors. Third, silence. When it comes from someone who genuinely understands the mechanics of financial risk, is not the same thing as weakness, even when it looks that way to an anxious public watching the clock count down in real time. And fourth, none of this is actually over. A 3-day pause tied to documents that were still being finalized as the announcement went out is not a resolution. It is a postponement, and the underlying legal, political, and economic pressures that built up over these past several weeks have not disappeared just because a deadline got pushed to Friday. What happens over these next few days, whether that agreement gets fully signed, whether automotive tariffs actually settle somewhere close to 15%, whether Canadian provinces follow through on putting American alcohol back on store shelves, and whether Congress ever moves on stripping Section 338 out of the law altogether, will shape how this entire relationship functions for years to come. The tariffs did not disappear on August 19th. They got paused hours before taking effect, after weeks of Canada holding its most powerful cards face down on the table and letting Washington's own exclusions do the negotiating for it. That is the real story underneath the headline, not a dramatic last-minute rescue, but the quiet, disciplined payoff of leverage that was there the entire time, waiting to be used exactly when it mattered most. If this breakdown helped you understand what actually happened behind the headlines this week, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this story develops once those documents are finally signed. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Did Carney's silence genuinely win this standoff? Or did Canada simply get lucky with timing heading into an American election year? And if you know someone who's been following this trade fight through nothing but sound bites, share this with them, because the real story was never just about hockey sticks and dairy quotas. It was about which side actually understood the leverage it was holding all along.